I'm Sarah Chen, and at 32 years old, I thought I knew exactly who my family was. I was wrong. What I discovered at our annual 4th of July barbecue didn't just shatter my understanding of my parents, it revealed a deception so calculated, so cruel, that it would force me to make the most difficult decision of my life. Sometimes the people who claim to love you unconditionally are the very ones plotting your destruction behind closed doors. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as an adopted child in the Chen household, I always felt like I had to prove I belonged. My parents, David and Linda Chen, were both successful real estate developers who had built their empire from nothing. They owned Chen Associates, a boutique firm specializing in luxury commercial properties throughout the Pacific Northwest. When they adopted me at 6 months old, they already had my older brother Marcus, their biological son, who was 3 at the time. From my earliest memories, I understood that I was different. Not because my parents ever made me feel unwanted, quite the opposite. They showered me with love, opportunities, and every advantage money could buy. Private schools, piano lessons, horseback riding, summer camps in Europe. If anything, I sometimes wondered if they spoiled me more than Marcus, as if they were overcompensating for something I couldn't quite identify. The Chen family story was one of immigrant success and the American dream realized. My father, David, had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but determination and a business degree that American companies initially refused to recognize. He worked construction during the day and studied for his real estate license at night, sleeping 4 hours and surviving on instant coffee and pure ambition. My mother, Linda, second-generation Chinese-American, had grown up in Seattle's International District where her parents ran a small grocery store that barely kept the family afloat. David and Linda met at a real estate seminar in 1985. She was working as an administrative assistant at a large commercial firm, secretly taking night classes in business management. He was the eager newcomer asking questions that made seasoned agents roll their eyes. But Linda saw something in his intensity, his refusal to accept limitations that others took for granted. 6 months later, they were married. 18 months. After that, they had scraped together enough money to start their own company. The early years were lean. They worked out of our garage, with Linda handling administrative duties while pregnant with Marcus, and David driving his beat-up Honda to meet clients at properties they couldn't afford to rent office space near. Every commission check went back into the business. Every weekend was spent networking at community events, building relationships one conversation at a time. Their breakthrough came in 1990 when they landed their first major commercial development deal. A tech startup needed office space in Bellevue, and the Chen's willingness to work with their unconventional timeline and budget requirements earned them not just a client, but a partnership that would define their future. As Seattle's tech boom exploded through the 90s, Chen Associates grew alongside it. By the time I was old enough to understand what my parents did for work, they were handling multi-million-dollar transactions. Our family had moved from a modest 3-bedroom house in Renton to a sprawling estate in Medina, complete with a swimming pool, tennis court, and enough space to host the elaborate parties that had become essential to their business networking. Marcus and I grew up in this world of success and ambition. The expectations were always clear, even if never explicitly stated. Excellence wasn't optional. Whether it was grades, extracurricular activities, or social connections, we were representatives of the Chen family brand. Marcus embraced this role naturally. He was gregarious, charming, academically gifted, and possessed an intuitive understanding of business that made our parents beam with pride. I took a different path. While Marcus studied business and economics, I gravitated toward psychology and social work. While he spent summers interning at real estate firms and investment companies, I volunteered at homeless shelters and youth crisis centers. My parents supported these choices publicly, even proudly mentioning my community service at their business events. But I sometimes caught glimpses of confusion, as if they couldn't quite understand why someone with every advantage would choose to work with society's most vulnerable populations. After graduating from the University of Washington with a master's degree in clinical social work, I accepted a position at Seattle Children's Hospital, working with families in crisis. The pay was a fraction of what I could have earned joining the family business, but the work felt meaningful in ways that property development never could. I specialized in working with children who had experienced trauma, particularly those in the foster care system. This choice created the first real tension in our otherwise harmonious family dynamic. Not open conflict, but a subtle undercurrent of disappointment that I was wasting my education and opportunities. My father would make comments about how social work was noble but impractical, and how I could help more people by building wealth and donating to charities rather than working in them directly. Marcus, meanwhile, had joined Chen Associates immediately after college and was proving himself a worthy successor to the family legacy. He had inherited our father's business instincts and our mother's people skills, plus a technological savvy that helped modernize their approach to marketing and client relations. By his 28th birthday, he was already handling major deals, independently and being groomed to eventually take over the company. Despite these different paths, our family remained close. Sunday dinners were sacred. Holiday celebrations were elaborate affairs that brought together extended family, business associates, and longtime friends. The annual 4th of July barbecue had become something of a tradition, a way for my parents to thank their employees, celebrate with friends, and showcase the beautiful home and life they had built. I had always looked forward to these gatherings. They represented everything I loved about my family: our ability to bring people together, our generosity in sharing our good fortune, and the warmth that existed beneath all the professional networking and business talk. These events felt authentic in a way that some of the more formal business functions did not. The summer I turned 32, everything seemed perfect on the surface. I had recently been promoted to senior social worker and was leading a new program designed to keep families together during crisis periods. My work was challenging but rewarding, and I was making a real difference in people's lives. Marcus had just closed the biggest deal in company history, a mixed-use development project that would transform an entire neighborhood in South Lake Union. My parents were talking about semi-retirement, possibly traveling more, while Marcus gradually assumed greater leadership responsibilities. I was even seeing someone seriously for the first time in years. James Rodriguez was a pediatric nurse at the hospital where I worked, and our relationship had developed slowly from professional collaboration to genuine friendship to something deeper. He was kind, funny, dedicated to his work with sick children, and completely unimpressed by my family's wealth. When I brought him to family dinners, my parents were polite but distant. They never said anything directly critical, but I could sense their disappointment that I wasn't dating someone more suitable, meaning someone from their social and economic circle. James had noticed this tension but handled it with characteristic grace. He understood that my relationship with my family was complicated and important to me, so he never pressured me to choose sides or demanded that they accept him. His patience and understanding only made me love him more, and I had begun to think seriously about our future together. The week before the 4th of July barbecue, my mother called to discuss the guest list and logistics. These events had grown over the years from casual backyard gatherings to semi-formal affairs catered by professional companies and attended by Seattle's business elite. This year would be particularly special, she explained, because they were planning to announce Marcus's engagement to Jennifer Walsh, daughter of another prominent real estate family. I had met Jennifer several times and found her pleasant enough, though I sometimes wondered if Marcus was in love with her or with the strategic alliance her family connections represented. She was beautiful, well-educated, and came from the right background, but their interactions always seemed slightly performative to me. Still, Marcus appeared happy, and Jennifer seemed genuinely fond of him, so I kept my observations to myself. My mother wanted to make sure I understood the importance of this particular gathering. Business associates would be attending, including potential investors in a new development project. The mayor's office was sending representatives. Local media might cover the event as part of a feature on successful immigrant entrepreneurs. Everything needed to be perfect. I assured her that I understood and would dress appropriately, bring an impressive dessert, and make sure James wore something suitable for the occasion. My mother's pause after I mentioned James was barely perceptible, but I caught it. She recovered, quickly, saying she was looking forward to seeing both of us. But something in her tone felt forced. The day of the barbecue dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for an outdoor celebration. I spent the morning making my grandmother's recipe for black sesame cheesecake, a dessert that had become my signature contribution to family gatherings. James helped me transport everything to my parents' house, along with a carefully chosen bottle of wine that we hoped would demonstrate appropriate appreciation for the occasion. When we arrived at the Medina estate, the transformation was already underway. Professional caterers were setting up elegant food stations throughout the backyard. A small army of servers moved efficiently between the outdoor kitchen and various seating areas. String lights had been hung between the mature oak trees, creating a magical ambiance that would be perfect once the sun set. My parents had always known how to entertain, but this event was clearly operating on a different level than previous years. The guest list had apparently expanded significantly, and the attention to detail suggested they were treating this as much as a business function, as a family celebration. Marcus was already there when we arrived, looking every inch the successful young executive in his perfectly tailored casual wear. Jennifer stood beside him, radiant in a way that suggested she knew what announcement was coming later. They made a striking couple, and I could see how proud my parents were as they introduced them to arriving guests. I found my mother in the kitchen, supervising final preparations with the catering manager. She looked beautiful and confident, every detail of her appearance carefully considered. When she saw me, her smile was genuine but brief. "Sarah, darling, you look lovely," she said, embracing me carefully to avoid disturbing her hair and makeup. "And James, thank you for coming. I've put you both at table 6 with the Andersons and the Kim family. I thought you'd enjoy their company." Table 6 was not where immediate family typically sat during formal portions of these events, but I didn't comment. Perhaps she was trying to spare James from the intensive business conversations that would dominate the family table. Or maybe she was managing some other dynamic I wasn't aware of. The early hours of the party unfolded exactly as expected. Guests arrived in waves, each group bringing their own energy and conversation topics. Seattle's summer social season was in full swing, and many of these people would see each other at multiple events throughout July and August. The networking was as important as the celebration, and my parents moved through the crowd with practiced ease. I spent time catching up with family friends I hadn't seen in months, introducing James to people I thought he might find interesting, and generally playing my role as the gracious daughter. Several people commented on my work at the hospital, having read about our new family preservation program in local news coverage. These conversations felt genuine and rewarding in a way that purely social small talk never did. As the afternoon progressed, I noticed my parents seemed somewhat tense despite the party's obvious success. They were performing their roles as hosts perfectly, but something felt slightly off. My father was drinking more than usual, and my mother's smile occasionally appeared forced. Marcus seemed unaware of any underlying tension, busy with his own hosting duties and clearly excited about his upcoming engagement announcement. James and I had found a comfortable rhythm, alternating between circulating separately and reconvening, to share observations about the various guests and conversations. He had a gift for putting people at ease, and I watched several of my father's business associates warm to him, despite their initial reserve when introduced to Sarah's friend from the hospital. The formal dinner portion of the evening began around 6 o'clock. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The catering staff had outdone themselves, creating a menu that balanced elegant presentation with approachable flavors. Multiple courses were served at beautifully appointed round tables scattered throughout the backyard, each seating 8 guests in carefully considered combinations. Table 6 turned out to be delightful company. Dr. Anderson was a retired physician who had worked with refugee populations, and his wife Margaret had spent decades volunteering with literacy programs. The Kim family had built their own successful business in import or export, and their children were pursuing careers in medicine and education. The conversation flowed easily from professional experiences to travel stories to observations about Seattle's changing landscape. James fit seamlessly into these discussions, sharing stories from his work at the hospital and asking thoughtful questions about everyone else's experiences. I felt proud watching him engage so naturally with people from completely different backgrounds and professional worlds. His genuine curiosity about others and complete lack of pretension were qualities I had fallen in love with, and seeing them appreciated by my family's friends reinforced my feelings about our relationship. During the main course, my father stood to address the gathering. He had always been a compelling speaker, able to command attention without seeming to demand it. The conversations gradually quieted as he began to talk about gratitude, family, and the American dream that had allowed him and my mother to build their life in Seattle. His remarks were polished and heartfelt, touching on themes that resonated with this particular audience of immigrants, entrepreneurs, and community leaders. He spoke about the importance of hard work, the value of education, and the responsibility that comes with success. These were familiar themes from previous years, but his delivery seemed more emotional than usual as he transitioned to more personal topics. My father's gaze moved across the gathered guests before settling briefly on our family table. Marcus and Jennifer sat together, clearly anticipating their moment. My mother watched from her position near the kitchen access, her expression carefully neutral. Linda and I have been blessed with family, friends, and opportunities beyond what we could have imagined when we started this journey 40 years ago, my father continued. Tonight, we want to share some of that blessing by celebrating new beginnings and the next generation of our family legacy. This was the cue for Marcus and Jennifer's engagement announcement. I smiled, preparing to applaud and celebrate my brother's happiness. But my father's next words caught me completely off guard. As many of you know, building a business, like building a family, requires difficult decisions. Sometimes you have to let go of elements that don't serve the greater good, no matter how much affection you might have for them personally. The statement felt oddly phrased for an engagement announcement, and I saw several guests exchange confused glances. Marcus looked puzzled, clearly expecting his father to transition to celebration rather than continuing with vague philosophical observations. My father's expression had shifted subtly, becoming more serious than the occasion seemed to warrant. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made the evening air feel suddenly heavy. Tonight, Linda and I want to be clear about our values and our expectations for the future. We believe in family loyalty, in shared commitments, and in supporting decisions that strengthen rather than weaken what we've built together. I felt James shift slightly beside me, his attention now fully focused on my father's words. Something was happening that none of us had anticipated, and the celebratory atmosphere was evaporating by degrees. My mother had moved closer to the main table, her face carefully composed but her body language suggesting tension. Marcus was frowning slightly, clearly confused about where this speech was heading. Jennifer looked between her fiancé and his father, uncertain whether this was part of some plan she hadn't been informed about. Which brings me to a difficult but necessary topic, my father continued, his voice growing colder. Sarah, would you please stand up? The request was so unexpected that I hesitated, unsure whether I had heard correctly. Conversations at nearby tables had stopped completely, and I could feel dozens of eyes turning toward me. James reached for my hand under the table, a gesture of support that somehow made the moment feel even more ominous. "Sarah," my father repeated, his tone making it clear this was not a request. "Please stand." I rose slowly, my heart beginning to race, though I couldn't understand why. The gathered guests watched in complete silence, the festive energy of moments before replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to emanate from my father's increasingly stern demeanor. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you to someone you all think you know," he said, gesturing toward me with what might have been contempt. "My adopted daughter, Sarah, who has spent the last several years making choices that demonstrate her complete lack of gratitude for everything this family has provided." The words hit me like physical blows. I stared at my father, unable to comprehend what was happening or why he was speaking about me this way in front of our guests. This was not the man who had raised me, supported my education, celebrated my achievements. This was someone else entirely, someone cold and cruel, who seemed to view me as an enemy rather than his daughter. Sarah has chosen to waste her education working with society's failures instead of contributing to our family's success. She has chosen to pursue a relationship with someone who offers nothing to our family's future. Most importantly, she has chosen to reject the values and expectations that define who we are as a family. Each accusation felt more surreal than the last. I looked desperately toward my mother, expecting her to intervene, to stop this public humiliation that made no sense in the context of our relationship. But her expression was granite, offering no support or explanation. Marcus started to rise from his seat, clearly intending to interrupt what was becoming a devastating attack on his sister. But my father's sharp gesture stopped him before he could speak. "Marcus understands loyalty," my father continued, his voice now carrying the authority he used in his most challenging business negotiations. "Marcus understands that family success requires sacrifice and commitment. Marcus has chosen a partner who strengthens our family rather than weakening it." The contrast he was drawing became painfully clear. Jennifer represented everything they wanted in a daughter-in-law: wealth, connections, social status. James represented everything they found threatening or disappointing: modest background, service-oriented career, lack of material ambition. But this still felt like a massive overreaction to dating choices they disapproved of. There had to be something more, some catalyst that had triggered this public confrontation. As I stood there, humiliated and confused, I tried to understand what had changed between our last family dinner and this moment. "Therefore," my father announced, his voice now carrying the finality of a business decision, "Linda and I have decided that Sarah is no longer welcome in this family. Her choices have made it clear that she values her own selfish desires over family loyalty and success. As of tonight, she is dead to us." The silence that followed his declaration was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel James, rising from his chair behind me, could sense the shock and discomfort radiating from the assembled guests. But I could not process what had just happened. Dead to them. Cast out. Disowned. In front of 50 of Seattle's most prominent business and social leaders. With no warning, no private conversation, no opportunity to understand or respond to whatever had prompted this brutal rejection. My mother's face remained impassive, offering no contradiction to my father's pronouncement. Marcus looked stricken, his mouth open as if preparing to speak, but no words emerging. Jennifer had gone pale, clearly horrified to have her engagement celebration transformed into this family destruction. "Sarah," my father said, his tone now businesslike and dismissive, "you and your friend need to leave, immediately." The word friend was delivered with particular venom, making it clear that James was not simply unwelcome but actively despised. I felt him step closer behind me, offering support in the face of this inexplicable attack. I tried to speak, to ask what had prompted this, to understand what I had done to deserve such treatment. But my voice wouldn't work. The shock was too complete, the humiliation too overwhelming. I had been prepared for many things that evening, but not for this systematic destruction of my place in the family that had raised me. James's hand touched my shoulder gently. "Sarah," he said quietly, "we should go." His voice broke through my paralysis. I looked around at the faces surrounding me, some horrified, some embarrassed, some carefully neutral. These were people who had known me my entire life, who had watched me grow up, who had celebrated my achievements at previous gatherings. Now they were witnessing my complete rejection by the people who had claimed to love me most. I managed a single word. Why? My father's expression didn't soften. If anything, it grew colder. "You know why," he said. "And if you don't, that only proves how right we are about this decision." The circular logic was maddening. I was being punished for something I apparently should know but didn't understand. Rejected for reasons that were supposed to be obvious but felt completely arbitrary. The man speaking these words bore no resemblance to the father who had taught me to ride a bike, who had celebrated my graduation, who had told me he was proud of my work helping children. James moved to my side, taking my arm gently but firmly. "Come on," he murmured. "Let's go." Part of me wanted to fight, to demand explanations, to refuse to leave until someone told me what had precipitated this nightmare. But the larger part of me needed to escape the stares, the whispers that were beginning to start, the overwhelming shame of being publicly cast out by my own family. As we moved toward the house to collect our things, I heard my father resume speaking to the guests, his tone shifting back to the jovial host as if nothing unusual had occurred. He was transitioning to Marcus and Jennifer's engagement announcement, transforming my humiliation into a backdrop for their celebration. The contrast was devastating. My destruction was simply a prelude to my brother's triumph, my rejection clearing the stage for his acceptance and elevation. Whatever had motivated my parents' decision, they had chosen this moment specifically to maximize the impact of both messages. James stayed close as I gathered my purse and the now absurd cheesecake I had brought to contribute to the family celebration. The kitchen staff avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable witnesses to family drama they hadn't expected to encounter. The caterers continued their work with professional determination to maintain the event's momentum, despite the personal catastrophe that had just unfolded. As we walked through the house toward the front door, I caught glimpses of the photos that lined the hallways. Pictures of family vacations, graduations, holidays, business celebrations. My face appeared in hundreds of these images, smiling and happy, surrounded by people who had just declared me dead to them. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These walls told the story of a beloved daughter who had been cherished and supported throughout her life. But the reality I had just experienced suggested that love had been conditional in ways I had never understood, dependent on choices and behaviors that had never been clearly articulated. Outside, the summer evening continued exactly as it had before my world collapsed. The air was still warm, the light still golden, the neighborhood still peaceful and prosperous. But everything felt different now, like I was viewing a life that no longer belonged to me. James helped me into his car without saying anything. He seemed to understand that words would be inadequate for what had just occurred, that my need was for quiet support rather than analysis or comfort. As we drove away from the house where I had grown up, where I had felt safe and loved for 32 years, I tried to process what had just happened. I had been disowned, cut off, declared dead to the people who had raised me. In front of 50 witnesses, without explanation or warning, by parents who had seemed to love me unconditionally just weeks before. The questions came in waves. What had I done? What had changed? Why hadn't they spoken to me privately if they were unhappy with my choices? Why choose such a public and humiliating method of rejection? Why involve James in their anger when he had done nothing but treat me well and support my work? Most painfully, why hadn't Marcus defended me? My brother and I had always been close despite our different paths. He knew better than anyone how much our parents' approval meant to me, how hard I had worked to make them proud even when pursuing a career they didn't understand. His silence during my public humiliation felt like a second betrayal, perhaps even more painful than my parents' active rejection. As Seattle's familiar neighborhoods passed by the car windows, I realized that my entire understanding of my life had been wrong. The family I thought I knew, the relationships I had counted on, the unconditional love I had believed in, none of it had been real. Or perhaps it had been real once, but had been withdrawn for reasons I couldn't comprehend. James drove carefully, occasionally glancing over to check on me but not pressuring me to talk. His presence was comforting, a reminder that not everyone in my life had just revealed themselves to be someone completely different from who I thought they were. When we reached my apartment, I sat in the car for several minutes, unable to move. Going inside meant beginning to process what had happened, meant starting to figure out how to rebuild a life that had just been completely redefined. It meant accepting that the family gathering I had looked forward to had instead become the night I lost everything I thought I could count on. "Sarah," James said gently, "what do you need right now?" It was such a simple question, but I couldn't answer it. I didn't know what I needed because I didn't understand what had just occurred. I felt like I was drowning in confusion, humiliation, and a grief so profound it was hard to breathe. What I needed was for this to be a nightmare I could wake up from. What I needed was for my parents to call and explain this was some kind of misunderstanding. What I needed was for Marcus to arrive at my door with apologies and explanations that would make everything make sense again. But none of those things were going to happen. I could feel the finality in my father's words, could see the resolution in my mother's face. Whatever had prompted their decision, they had made it completely and intended it to be permanent. So what I needed, I realized, was to understand what had really happened to my family and why. I needed to know what had changed between the parents who had raised me and the strangers who had just cast me out. I needed to discover what I had missed, what signs I had ignored, what truth about my place in their lives I had been blind to. Most importantly, I needed to decide what I was going to do about it. Because sitting in James's car outside my apartment, still wearing the dress I had chosen to celebrate my brother's engagement, still carrying the cheesecake I had made for people who had declared me dead to them, I realized something important. I wasn't actually dead. And if they wanted to pretend I was, if they wanted to erase me from their lives and their story, then maybe it was time to show them what that really meant. The grief and shock were overwhelming, but underneath them, something else was beginning to stir. Something that felt like the same determination that had gotten me through graduate school, through the challenging cases at work, through every difficult situation I had faced in my adult life. If my family thought they could destroy me with a single brutal declaration, they were about to learn they had seriously underestimated the woman they had raised. The question was no longer why they had done this to me. The question was what I was going to do in response. As I finally got out of the car and walked toward my apartment, I felt the first stirrings of a plan beginning to form. If I was dead to them, then Sarah Chen, the grateful adopted daughter, was indeed gone. But Sarah Chen, the independent woman who had built her own life and career, was very much alive. And she was about to become someone they never expected her to be. The first week after the barbecue passed in a haze of shock and disbelief. I called in sick to work, something I had never done unless I was genuinely ill. But this felt like an illness of the soul, a complete disruption of everything I had believed about my life and relationships. James stayed with me most of that time, bringing groceries, fielding phone calls from concerned colleagues, and simply being present while I tried to process what had happened. My phone remained eerily silent. No calls from my parents, no texts from Marcus, no outreach from any of the family friends who had witnessed my public humiliation. The silence was almost worse than the original confrontation because it confirmed that what had happened was real and permanent. This wasn't a misunderstanding that would be cleared up with apologies and explanations. This was a deliberate severing that my family intended to maintain. James finally convinced me to see Dr. Patricia Morales, a therapist who specialized in family trauma and relationship dissolution. Dr. Morales had a gentle but direct approach that helped me begin to articulate the confusion and pain I was experiencing. During our first session, she asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Sarah, when you think back over the past year, were there any signs that your parents were becoming increasingly dissatisfied with your choices? Any comments or behaviors that might have indicated growing tension?" I wanted to say no immediately, to insist that their reaction had come completely out of nowhere. But as I sat in her comfortable office, really thinking about the question, I began to remember small moments that had felt odd at the time, but which I had dismissed or rationalized. There had been my mother's reaction when I brought James to Easter dinner. She had been polite but distant, asking him surface-level questions about his work, but never engaging in the deeper conversations she typically had with people she was getting to know. When James excused himself to help with dishes, I had asked her what she thought of him. Her response had been carefully neutral, praising his kindness while noting that he seemed very different from the kind of men you usually date. I had pointed out that I hadn't dated anyone seriously in over 2 years, so there wasn't really a pattern to compare him to. But my mother had given me a look that suggested she thought I was being deliberately obtuse. At the time, I had assumed she just needed more time to get to know him. Then there had been my father's reaction to the promotion I had received at the hospital. When I called to share the news, expecting congratulations, his response had been lukewarm. He had asked about the salary increase, and when I told him it was modest, he had made a comment about how I was limiting my potential by staying in social work. The conversation had shifted quickly to Marcus's latest business achievements, and I had felt dismissed in a way that was unusual for our typically supportive relationship. There had been other moments too. Comments about my apartment being too small for someone your age, suggestions that I should consider moving back to the family neighborhood, questions about whether I was really happy with my career choices. Each individual conversation had seemed like normal parental concern, but taken together, they painted a picture of growing dissatisfaction with the direction of my life. Most troubling were the memories of conversations that had stopped abruptly when I entered rooms. I had noticed this happening several times over the past few months during family dinners and visits. My parents and Marcus would be talking quietly, but would immediately switch to neutral topics when I appeared. I had assumed they were discussing business matters or family friend gossip that they didn't think would interest me. Now I wondered if they had been discussing me. Dr. Morales helped me understand that families often build up to major confrontations over time, with smaller disagreements and disappointments accumulating until they reach a breaking point. What had happened at the barbecue might have felt sudden to me, but it was likely the result of months or even years of my parents' growing frustration with choices they couldn't accept. The public nature of the confrontation suggests this wasn't just about expressing disappointment, she explained. That level of humiliation serves a specific purpose. It's designed to be so devastating that reconciliation becomes nearly impossible. Your parents weren't just ending their relationship with you, they were making sure you couldn't easily return. This observation hit me like a physical blow. The cruelty of their approach wasn't accidental or emotional, it was strategic. They had chosen the most hurtful possible method of rejection specifically to ensure that I couldn't fight back or argue for forgiveness. By making my exile public and absolute, they had eliminated any possibility of a private conversation that might lead to reconciliation. As the second week began, I forced myself to return to work. My colleagues were kind but curious, having heard through Seattle's interconnected professional networks that something dramatic had happened at a prominent family's 4th of July celebration. I deflected most questions with vague references to family disagreements and threw myself into my caseload with an intensity that worried my supervisor. Working with children in crisis provided a strange comfort during this period. Their problems were immediate and solvable in ways that my family situation was not. I could advocate for a child's safety, help parents develop better communication skills, or connect families with resources they needed. Each small success felt like proof that I was still competent and valuable, even if my own family had decided otherwise. But the work also forced me to confront uncomfortable parallels. Many of the families I counseled struggled with issues of acceptance, conditional love, and the ways that parents could damage children through rejection or impossible expectations. I had always approached these cases with empathy, but also with a certain emotional distance. Now I understood from the inside what it felt like to discover that parental love wasn't as unconditional as you had believed. 3 weeks after the barbecue, I received an unexpected visitor at work. My supervisor knocked on my office door during lunch and said there was someone asking to see me. When I went to the reception area, I found Jennifer Walsh sitting uncomfortably in one of the waiting room chairs. She looked different than she had at the barbecue. Her usual polished confidence was replaced by obvious nervousness, and she kept glancing toward the door as if she might change her mind and leave. When she saw me, she stood quickly and asked if we could talk privately somewhere. We found an empty conference room, and Jennifer spent several minutes fidgeting with her purse before finally speaking. What she told me changed everything I thought. I understood about my family's rejection. "Sarah, I need you to know that I had no idea what was going to happen that night," she began. "Marcus didn't know either. Your father planned the whole thing without telling anyone except your mother." She explained that the engagement announcement was supposed to be a simple, joyful moment during the dinner portion of the evening. Marcus had been expecting their parents to make a brief toast and then let them share their news. Instead, David had used the platform to systematically destroy his adopted daughter's place in the family. "Marcus was devastated," Jennifer continued. "He tried to call you that night, but your father forbade it. He said that anyone who maintained contact with you would be choosing sides, and that the family needed to present a united front." This information was both comforting and infuriating. It was a relief to know that Marcus hadn't willingly participated in my humiliation, but it was enraging to learn that my father was actively preventing my brother from reaching out to me. The control he was exerting over the family's response to my exile was more extensive than I had realized. Jennifer hesitated before continuing with information that would prove to be the key to understanding everything that had happened. "There's something else you need to know. Your parents hired a private investigator to follow you." The words didn't make sense at first. Why would my parents need to investigate their own daughter? What could they possibly have been looking for that they couldn't simply ask me about? "They were building a case," Jennifer explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Evidence that your lifestyle and choices were embarrassing to the family's reputation. The investigator documented where you went, who you spent time with, what kinds of places you frequented for work and personal activities." My mind raced as I tried to understand the implications. My work often took me to parts of Seattle that were far from my parents' affluent circles. I visited clients in low-income housing, met with families in crisis at emergency shelters, attended community meetings in neighborhoods where my parents would never go. If someone was documenting these activities without context, they could easily be made to look like I was associating with undesirable people for personal rather than professional reasons. "They were also investigating James," Jennifer continued, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "His background, his family, his financial situation. They found out about his student loans, his parents' immigration status, his brother's arrest record from 10 years ago." The invasiveness of this surveillance was staggering. My parents had treated my relationship like a threat that needed to be assessed and neutralized rather than a personal choice that deserved their respect. They had violated both my privacy and James's, gathering ammunition to use against us without either of us knowing we were being watched. Jennifer pulled a manila envelope from her purse and placed it on the table between us. Marcus asked me to give you this. It's copies of some of the investigators' reports. He thought you should know what they were saying about you. I stared at the envelope, afraid to open it, but knowing I needed to see what kind of case had been built against me. Inside were dozens of photographs and surveillance reports documenting my activities over a period of 6 months. Pictures of me entering homeless shelters, meeting with clients at community centers, having dinner with James at modest restaurants he could afford on a nurse's salary. Each image was accompanied by typed commentary that presented my professional activities in the most negative possible light. My work with homeless populations was described as associating with drug addicts and criminals. My visits to low-income neighborhoods were characterized as frequenting dangerous areas. My relationship with James was documented with particular attention to what the investigator termed concerning family connections and financial instability. The reports also included detailed information about James's background that my parents could never have obtained through normal conversation. His parents had immigrated from El Salvador and worked in restaurant and cleaning services. His younger brother had been arrested for vandalism as a teenager, though the charges had been dropped. His student loan debt from nursing school was substantial. His family lived in a modest apartment in Georgetown rather than owning property. None of these facts were shameful or problematic, but they were presented in language designed to make James seem like an inappropriate choice for someone from my family's social and economic position. The investigator had even included speculation about whether James was using the relationship for financial advancement, and whether my work in social services was influenced by romantic attachment to someone from a lower socioeconomic background. Reading these reports was like seeing my life through a funhouse mirror that distorted everything I valued about myself and my choices. My commitment to helping vulnerable populations was reframed as poor judgment. My relationship with a kind, dedicated man was presented as evidence of my inability to make appropriate decisions. My independence and career satisfaction were characterized as rebellion against family expectations. Your father showed these to several of his business associates, Jennifer said quietly. He was building support for his decision to cut you off. He wanted people to understand that he was being forced to take action because your behavior was becoming a liability to the family's reputation. The strategic nature of my parents' campaign became clear. This wasn't an emotional reaction to disappointment about my choices. This was a calculated effort to isolate me from potential supporters and justify their decision to the broader community. By framing my exile as a necessary response to my increasingly problematic behavior, they were protecting themselves from criticism while making it nearly impossible for me to defend myself. Jennifer's hands shook slightly as she explained the final piece of information Marcus had wanted me to know. Your father has been telling people that you've been struggling with substance abuse and mental health issues. He says that's why you're working in social services, because you relate to the populations you serve. He claims the family tried to get you help, but you refused treatment. This lie was so outrageous that I initially couldn't process it. My father was actively spreading rumors that I was addicted to drugs and mentally unstable. He was using my career choice as evidence of personal problems rather than professional dedication. He was telling Seattle's business community that my family had tried to intervene, but that I was beyond help. The sophistication of this character assassination was breathtaking. By positioning himself as the concerned father who had been forced to make difficult decisions, my father was generating sympathy for himself while making me seem like the family member who had become a dangerous liability. Anyone who questioned his treatment of me would be told that they didn't understand the full situation, that the family had been dealing with my problems privately for years. Marcus wanted you to know so you could protect yourself, Jennifer concluded. People are going to believe what they're being told unless you can prove otherwise. And your father is making sure his version of events reaches anyone who might matter professionally or socially. After Jennifer left, I sat in the conference room for over an hour, staring at the surveillance reports and trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had been done to me. My parents hadn't just rejected me, they had systematically destroyed my reputation and relationships within their social and business networks. They had turned my strengths into weaknesses, my values into character flaws, and my independence into evidence of instability. The cruelty was stunning, but so was the intelligence behind it. My father had anticipated that people might question his treatment of his adopted daughter, so he had prepared explanations that would satisfy their curiosity while making me seem like the problem. He had created a narrative in which he was the victim of an ungrateful child rather than the perpetrator of family destruction. That evening, I called Dr. Morales for an emergency session. I needed help processing not just the surveillance and lies, but the realization that my parents had been planning this campaign for months while continuing to include me in family activities and pretending to support my life choices. This level of deception and manipulation suggests personality disorders that go far beyond normal family dysfunction, Dr. Morales explained. Your father, in particular, is demonstrating narcissistic and sociopathic behaviors. The surveillance, the lies, the calculated timing of your public humiliation. These are not the actions of someone who loves you but disagrees with your choices. These are the actions of someone who views you as a threat to be eliminated. She helped me understand that my father's behavior fit patterns of psychological abuse that are often hidden within successful, high-functioning families. To the outside world, he appeared to be a devoted parent making difficult decisions about a troubled child. But his actions revealed someone who was willing to destroy his daughter's life and reputation to maintain control over his family's image and narrative. The fact that he prevented Marcus from contacting you shows that he understands his actions can't withstand scrutiny, Dr. Morales continued. He needs to control the information flow to maintain his version of events. If Marcus were allowed to maintain a relationship with you, he might discover that the problems your father describes don't actually exist. This insight was crucial for understanding what I was really facing. This wasn't a family disagreement that could be resolved through communication or compromise. This was a deliberate campaign to erase me from my family's life and destroy my ability to defend myself or seek reconciliation. My father had declared war, and he was fighting it with weapons I hadn't even known existed. Over the following days, I began to notice the impact of my father's lies. Colleagues at the hospital started treating me with a new kind of careful concern, asking if I was feeling okay and offering help with my caseload in ways that suggested they had heard rumors about my stability. The head of the social work department called me in for a meeting to discuss stress management and suggested I might benefit from a mental health evaluation. Former classmates from graduate school stopped responding to my texts and emails. Family friends who had always been warm and welcoming suddenly seemed to avoid me at professional events. The network of relationships I had built over years of living in Seattle was quietly but systematically being poisoned by my father's campaign of lies. James bore the brunt of this character assassination as well. His supervisor at the hospital began questioning his judgment and professional relationships. Rumors circulated about his criminal family background and financial motivations for dating me. The stress of defending himself against accusations he couldn't understand began to take a toll on his own work and emotional health. 1 month after the barbecue, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. I hired my own private investigator. Elena Vasquez was a former police detective who had started her own agency specializing in corporate and family investigations. She came highly recommended by the attorney I had consulted about potential defamation actions against my father. Elena was thorough, discreet, and completely unimpressed by my family's social status or business success. If your father has been conducting surveillance on you, there are likely records, receipts, and communications that can be discovered, she explained during our initial meeting. More importantly, if he's willing to lie about you this extensively, he's probably lying about other things as well. People who build campaigns of deception usually have vulnerabilities they're trying to hide. I gave Elena permission to investigate my family's business and personal activities with the same thoroughness they had applied to my life. I wanted to understand not just what they had done to me, but what they might be hiding about themselves. If my father was willing to destroy his daughter's reputation to protect his own image, what exactly was he protecting? Elena's investigation began with the basics: financial records, business filings, property transactions, and legal documents that were part of the public record. She also looked into the private investigator my parents had hired, tracing his client list and methods to understand the scope of surveillance I had been subjected to. What she discovered in those first weeks of investigation would provide the foundation for everything that followed. But more importantly, it would reveal that my father's treatment of me was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of deception and manipulation that had been hidden beneath the Chen family's success story for years. The first breakthrough came when Elena identified the private investigator my parents had hired. Richard Brennan operated a small agency that specialized in what he termed family protection services. His client list included several wealthy Seattle families who had used his services to investigate their children's romantic partners, business associates, and personal activities. Brennan's methods were more invasive than legal surveillance, typically allowed. He had used long-range photography, electronic monitoring, and social media infiltration to gather information about me and James. Some of his techniques bordered on stalking and could potentially be prosecuted if we chose to pursue legal action. More importantly, Elena discovered that Brennan had been investigating other targets for my parents as well. Marcus's previous girlfriends had been subjected to similar surveillance, though none of those relationships had lasted long enough to reach the level of public confrontation I had experienced. Several of my parents' business partners had been investigated when my father suspected them of disloyalty or potential betrayal. This pattern revealed that my father's need to control and monitor extended far beyond his relationship with me. He was systematically gathering information about anyone who might pose a threat to his carefully constructed image and business empire. The surveillance was not about protecting his family, but about maintaining his power and control over everyone in his orbit. Elena's financial investigation revealed even more troubling information. Chen Associates had been struggling financially for over 2 years despite maintaining the appearance of continued success. Several major development projects had failed to generate expected returns, and the company was carrying substantial debt that was hidden through complex accounting structures. My parents' personal finances reflected the same pattern. Their lifestyle and spending had not decreased to match their reduced income, and they were maintaining their affluent appearance through increasing levels of debt and creative financial maneuvering. The expensive barbecue that had been the setting for my humiliation had been financed through credit rather than available cash. This financial pressure provided context for understanding why my parents might be particularly focused on my brother's choice of marriage partner. Jennifer's family connections and wealth represented not just social advancement, but potential financial salvation for Chen Associates. My relationship with James, by contrast, offered no such advantages and might even be seen as a liability if my father was trying to present his family as successful and well-connected. Elena also discovered that my father had been spreading his lies about my supposed substance abuse and mental health problems more widely than Jennifer had indicated. He had contacted the licensing board for social workers, suggesting they should investigate my fitness to practice. He had reached out to administrators at the hospital where I worked, expressing concern about my stability and judgment. These actions went far beyond protecting his family's reputation. They were deliberate attempts to damage my career and professional standing. My father wasn't just cutting me out of his life. He was actively trying to destroy my ability to succeed independently. He was ensuring that my exile from the family would be accompanied by professional and social isolation as well. The most damaging discovery came when Elena uncovered communications between my father and several of his business associates, discussing their concerns about my behavior and their support for his decision to cut ties with me. These conversations revealed that my father had been building his case against me for months, carefully preparing key members of his social and business network to accept and endorse his eventual rejection. Reading transcripts of these conversations was devastating. People I had known my entire life, who had watched me grow up and had always seemed fond of me, were discussing my supposed problems and agreeing that my father was making the right choice in distancing the family from my influence. They accepted his lies without question and offered their support for what they saw as a difficult but necessary decision. But Elena's most important discovery was evidence that my father's campaign against me was motivated by more than just disappointment in my life choices. Hidden within the financial records and business communications was proof that my adoptive status had always been viewed differently than I had understood. Legal documents related to my adoption revealed that my parents had structured the arrangement specifically to limit my inheritance rights. Unlike Marcus, who was designated as heir to both personal and business assets, my legal status provided access only to a small trust fund that would mature when I turned 35. This trust had been established not out of love and provision, but as a minimal obligation that would satisfy legal requirements while ensuring that the bulk of family wealth remained with their biological child. More shocking was the discovery of a document my parents had filed with their attorney just 6 months before the barbecue. This document formally removed me from any claim to Chen Associates or other family business interests, citing my irresponsible lifestyle choices and failure to embrace family values as justification for complete disinheritance. This document had been prepared months before my father's public rejection, proving that their decision to cut me off was not a spontaneous reaction to the James relationship or my career choices. It was a planned disinheritance that had been in development for months, possibly years. The barbecue confrontation was simply the public announcement of a legal process that had already been completed in private. Elena's investigation revealed that I had never been viewed as a true family member with equal rights and standing. Despite 32 years of being told I was loved and valued, despite being raised alongside Marcus as his equal, despite being given every appearance of full acceptance and inclusion, I had always been treated as a temporary addition who could be removed when my presence was no longer convenient or advantageous. The adoption that I had understood as an act of love and generosity was revealed to be something much more calculated. My parents had wanted a daughter to complete their family image, but they had structured the legal and financial arrangements to ensure that this daughter could never threaten their biological son's inheritance or their control over family resources. As Elena compiled her findings into a comprehensive report, the full scope of my parents' deception became clear. They had spent 3 decades building an elaborate fiction of loving acceptance while systematically ensuring that I would never have genuine equality within the family structure. They had allowed me to believe I belonged while carefully maintaining legal and financial barriers that proved I never truly had. The lies about my substance abuse and mental health problems were simply the final phase of a longer campaign to justify my removal from a family that had never intended to include me permanently. My father's surveillance and character assassination were not reactions to my disappointing choices, but proactive steps to support a decision he had been planning for years. Understanding this truth was both liberating and devastating. It explained the subtle sense of being different that I had always felt but couldn't define. It revealed why my achievements had never seemed to generate the same pride and celebration that Marcus received. It clarified why my career choice had been met with such disproportionate disappointment and why my relationship with James had triggered such extreme reaction. But it also meant that everything I had believed about my place in the family was false. The love I had felt was real from my perspective, but it had been conditional and temporary from theirs. The security I had counted on was an illusion. The future I had imagined, which included continued family relationships and support, had never actually existed. Sitting in my apartment with Elena's report spread across my dining table, I faced a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could accept this devastating truth and try to build a new life from the wreckage of my old one. I could focus on healing from the trauma and moving forward without any connection to the people who had raised me. Or I could fight back. My parents had declared me dead to them, spreading lies to justify their rejection and ensure their version of events would be accepted without question. They had used their wealth and influence to isolate me professionally and socially. They had stolen 32 years of my life by allowing me to believe in love and acceptance that was never genuine. But they had made a critical error in their calculations. They had assumed that the grateful adopted daughter they had raised would accept their rejection quietly and disappear from their lives without causing problems. They had counted on my devastation and isolation, preventing me from mounting any effective response to their campaign of destruction. They had underestimated what 3 decades of feeling like I had to prove my worth had actually taught me. They had failed to consider that my work in social services had given me experience in fighting powerful people who abuse vulnerable populations. They had forgotten that my success in building an independent life and career demonstrated strength and determination they had apparently never fully appreciated. Most importantly, they had provided me with something I had never possessed before: complete freedom from any obligation to protect their feelings or reputation. If I was dead to them, then I owed them nothing. If they had chosen to make our family conflict public and vicious, then I was free to respond with equal force. As I began to formulate a plan for how to use Elena's discoveries, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that devastating night at the barbecue. I felt powerful, not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood the truth about my situation and could make informed decisions about my future. My parents had spent months planning my destruction. Now it was my turn to plan theirs. They had declared war on their own daughter, using weapons of deception, manipulation, and character assassination. But they had brought those weapons to a fight with someone who had spent her entire career protecting people from exactly the kind of abuse they had subjected me to. They thought they had destroyed me. They were about to learn that they had actually freed me to become someone they never expected me to be. Someone who would not only survive their attack, but would ensure they faced consequences for every lie they had told and every life they had damaged in pursuit of their perfect family image. The grateful daughter was indeed dead. But the woman who had taken her place was about to show them what that really meant. My plan began with something my father would never expect: complete transparency. If he was going to wage a war of lies and reputation destruction, I would counter with absolute truth. But I needed to be strategic about timing and execution. Elena had taught me that information warfare requires careful orchestration to achieve maximum impact. The first phase involved documenting everything. I gathered every piece of evidence Elena had uncovered, organized it into a comprehensive file, and made multiple copies stored in different locations. Medical records proving I had never sought treatment for substance abuse. Employment records showing my professional achievements and stellar performance reviews. Financial documents demonstrating my independence and responsible management of my own resources. I also began recording every interaction with anyone who repeated my father's lies. When the hospital administration called me in for another wellness check, I arrived with a small recording device and my attorney, Patricia Vance, a fierce advocate who specialized in defamation cases. The administrators were forced to admit they had no evidence of performance problems or concerning behavior, only concerns raised by a family member about my well-being. Patricia was particularly interested in the professional damage my father was attempting to inflict. His contacts with the Social Work Licensing Board and hospital administration crossed the line from family conflict into potential career sabotage. We began building a defamation case that could be filed if he continued his campaign of lies. Meanwhile, I started reaching out to reconnect with people my father had poisoned against me. The approach required delicacy, since I couldn't simply accuse him of lying without proof. Instead, I invited former friends and colleagues to coffee, listened to their concerns, and gently corrected misinformation with documented facts. Dr. Amanda Sterling, a psychiatrist I had worked with on several cases, was one of the first people willing to listen. She had heard rumors about my supposed instability and had been concerned enough to distance herself professionally. When I showed her my employment records, medical documentation, and evidence of my father's surveillance campaign, her reaction was immediate and angry. "Sarah, this is psychological abuse," she said, studying the private investigator's reports. "Your father is using classic manipulation tactics to isolate you from your support network. This isn't family disappointment. This is systematic destruction of your relationships and reputation." Dr. Sterling agreed to provide a professional evaluation of my mental health, which would serve as evidence against my father's claims. More importantly, she began subtly correcting misinformation among our mutual colleagues, explaining that the concerns about my stability were unfounded and based on malicious rumors rather than observed behavior. Each person I reconnected with provided insight into how extensively my father had spread his lies. He had been methodical, targeting specific individuals who could impact my career and social standing. But his campaign also revealed vulnerabilities I could exploit. Several people mentioned that my father seemed unusually anxious when discussing my supposed problems. He would become defensive when asked for specifics, deflecting questions about what treatment I had supposedly refused or what incidents had prompted his concern. His inability to provide concrete examples made some people skeptical of his claims. More tellingly, a few astute observers had noticed contradictions in his narrative. My work with vulnerable populations was presented as evidence of my own problems. But my professional success and the respect I had earned from colleagues didn't align with someone struggling with serious personal issues. The disconnect was becoming apparent to anyone who looked closely. The second phase of my plan involved strategic exposure of my family's real situation. Elena had uncovered enough financial irregularities to raise serious questions about Chen Associates' business practices. Some of their accounting methods bordered on fraudulent, and their debt situation was far more precarious than they were letting investors and partners know. I arranged a meeting with Tom Harrison, a financial journalist at the Seattle Business Journal who had covered my family's company favorably in the past. Tom was known for thorough investigative work and wouldn't print unsubstantiated allegations, but he was also relentless when he discovered evidence of corporate misconduct. "Sarah, I'll be honest," Tom said when I contacted him. "I've heard some concerning things about your personal situation. Your father reached out to me several months ago, expressing worry about your well-being and suggesting that family stress might be affecting your judgment." This was exactly what I had expected. My father was preemptively discrediting me with journalists who might investigate the family business. But Tom's journalistic instincts were stronger than his willingness to accept rumors without verification. I presented Tom with Elena's financial documentation methodically, letting him reach his own conclusions about the implications. The debt concealment, the misleading investor reports, the use of family assets to cover business shortfalls, all of it painted a picture of a company in crisis despite its public image of success. "If this information is accurate," Tom said, "after reviewing the documents, Chen Associates is essentially operating a house of cards. Their reported valuations don't match their actual financial position, and they're using new investments to cover existing debts rather than fund new projects." I also shared the timeline of my father's character assassination campaign, showing how it coincided with the company's increasing financial pressure. Tom immediately understood the implications. My father was potentially using family drama to distract from business problems and to ensure that my brother's marriage to Jennifer would proceed without complications that might threaten the financial benefits of that union. Tom agreed to investigate further, but warned me that any story he wrote would likely include details about the family conflict. I assured him that I was prepared for public exposure of the truth, having already endured public humiliation based on lies. While Tom conducted his investigation, I moved forward with the third phase of my plan: direct confrontation with my family's enablers. My father's campaign had succeeded, partly because respected members of the community had endorsed his version of events without demanding evidence. I intended to make them face the consequences of that endorsement. I started with Robert Kim, a family friend and business associate who had been particularly vocal in supporting my father's decision to cut ties with me. Robert had known me since childhood and had always seemed fond of me, making his willingness to accept lies about my character particularly hurtful. I called Robert and asked to meet with him privately. He agreed, probably expecting me to ask for his help in reconciling with my family. Instead, I arrived with documentation proving that every claim my father had made about my behavior was false, along with evidence of the surveillance and financial manipulation that had motivated his actions. Robert's reaction was everything I had hoped for. He was initially defensive, having committed himself to supporting my father's narrative. But as I presented proof of the deception, his expression shifted from skepticism to embarrassment to anger. "Sarah, if what you're showing me is true, then David has manipulated me into endorsing something unconscionable," Robert said, studying the private investigator's reports. I specifically told other people that I supported his decision because I trusted his judgment about family matters. "I understand that you believed you were supporting a friend making a difficult decision," I replied. "But I need you to understand that your endorsement gave his lies credibility they didn't deserve. Your reputation helped convince other people that his accusations were true." Robert agreed to review all the evidence with his own attorney and to issue corrections to anyone he had spoken with about the situation. More importantly, he promised to be more skeptical if my father approached him with future claims about family members or business associates. I repeated this process with several other community leaders who had publicly or privately supported my father's decision. Each confrontation was carefully planned and documented, focusing on the evidence rather than emotional appeals. I wasn't asking for sympathy, I was demanding accountability for their role in spreading lies. The cumulative effect was exactly what I had intended. Word began to spread through Seattle's interconnected business and social networks that David Chen's claims about his daughter were not only false, but part of a deliberate campaign of character assassination. People who had endorsed his decision were now questioning their judgment and distancing themselves from his narrative. More importantly, the community leaders I had confronted began asking harder questions about Chen Associates' business practices. If David was willing to lie so extensively about his own daughter, what else might he be misrepresenting? Their newfound skepticism created an environment where Tom Harrison's investigative reporting would be taken seriously, rather than dismissed as tabloid gossip. The fourth phase involved direct engagement with my family, but not in the way they expected. Rather than begging for reconciliation or trying to defend myself against their accusations, I began treating them as what they had revealed themselves to be: adversaries in a business dispute. I sent a formal letter to my father through Patricia Vance, my attorney, demanding that he cease making false statements about my mental health and professional competence. The letter included documentation proving his claims were lies and warned that continued defamation would result in legal action. Most importantly, it put him on notice that I was no longer the compliant daughter who would accept abuse without fighting back. My father's response came through his own attorney, a predictable deflection that claimed his statements were expressions of legitimate parental concern rather than defamatory attacks. But the fact that he felt the need to involve legal counsel showed that my counterattack was having an effect. I also sent a separate communication to Marcus through Jennifer, who had maintained some contact despite the family pressure to cut me off completely. This message was more personal but equally strategic. I provided Marcus with evidence of our father's financial manipulations and character assassination campaign, along with documentation showing that the disinheritance had been planned for years, regardless of my life choices. Marcus's response revealed exactly what I had suspected. He had been kept ignorant of the financial problems and the extent of our father's deception. Like everyone else, he had been fed a carefully constructed narrative that portrayed my exile as regrettable but necessary family discipline rather than calculated abuse. "Sarah, I had no idea about any of this," Marcus wrote in an encrypted email that Jennifer helped him send. "Dad told me you were struggling with personal problems and that the family needed to maintain boundaries for everyone's well-being. He never mentioned surveillance or lies to business associates. I thought he was protecting you by keeping family problems private." Marcus agreed to meet with me secretly, choosing a location where we wouldn't be observed by our father's surveillance network. The conversation was emotional and difficult, but it accomplished something crucial. It broke my father's control over the family narrative. When Marcus learned about the financial manipulation, the planned disinheritance, and the systematic lies, his reaction was swift and decisive. He immediately began his own investigation into the company's books and discovered additional irregularities that Elena had missed. As someone with insider access and legal authority within the business, Marcus could uncover evidence that would have been impossible for an outside investigator to obtain. "Dad has been using my signature on documents I never fully reviewed," Marcus told me during our second secret meeting. "Some of these contracts and financial statements contain representations that I didn't approve and wouldn't have agreed to if I had understood what I was signing." This revelation added a new dimension to the situation. My father hadn't just deceived investors and business partners, he had potentially implicated Marcus in fraudulent activities without his knowledge. Marcus was not only my brother, he was also a victim of our father's manipulation and control. With Marcus's cooperation, I gained access to information that transformed my defensive strategy into an offensive campaign. We had evidence of securities fraud, investor deception, and potential tax evasion. We also had proof that my father had used company resources to fund the private investigator and other personal expenses, essentially stealing from investors to finance his campaign against me. The fifth phase of my plan involved coordinating multiple forms of pressure to achieve maximum impact. Tom Harrison's investigative article was scheduled to publish in the Seattle Business Journal, exposing Chen Associates' financial irregularities and my father's character assassination campaign. Patricia Vance was prepared to file defamation, lawsuits against my father, and several business associates who had repeated his lies. The state attorney general's office had opened a preliminary investigation into potential securities fraud based on evidence Marcus and I had provided. But before any of these external pressures took effect, I wanted to give my parents one final opportunity to understand the consequences of their actions. I arranged to meet with them at their attorney's office, ostensibly to discuss terms for ending our family conflict. My parents arrived expecting to negotiate some kind of settlement that would formalize my exile while protecting them from further embarrassment. They brought their lawyer, their financial advisor, and a carefully prepared proposal for how I should quietly disappear from their lives in exchange for a modest financial payment. Instead, they found me with Patricia Vance, Elena Vasquez, and a comprehensive presentation of everything we had discovered about their deception, manipulation, and financial irregularities. What they had intended as a meeting to finalize my submission became their introduction to the scope of my resistance. "David and Linda," Patricia began, "my client is here to inform you that your campaign of defamation and character assassination has not only failed, but has exposed you to significant legal and financial liability." My mother maintained her composed facade, but I could see uncertainty in her eyes. My father attempted to maintain his authoritative demeanor, but his obvious discomfort betrayed his awareness that the situation had shifted beyond his control. I had Elena present the surveillance evidence first, showing the extent of their invasion of my privacy and the illegal methods used to gather information about my personal life. The documentation included receipts, photographs, and recorded conversations that proved the systematic nature of their campaign. This surveillance was not only inappropriate, but potentially criminal, Elena explained. The methods used violated several state laws regarding privacy and harassment. The targets of surveillance, including Sarah and James, would have grounds for significant civil and criminal complaints. Next, Patricia presented evidence of the defamation campaign, including recorded conversations where my father repeated lies about my mental health and substance abuse to business associates, hospital administrators, and professional colleagues. The documentation showed not only that the statements were false, but that my father knew they were false when he made them. Your statements have caused measurable damage to my client's professional reputation and career prospects, Patricia continued. The hospital administration, the Social Work Licensing Board, and several colleagues have all taken actions based on your false claims. This meets every legal standard for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Finally, I presented the financial evidence that Marcus and I had gathered, showing the true state of Chen Associates' finances and the fraudulent practices that had been used to conceal the company's problems from investors and partners. This evidence has already been shared with the State Attorney General's office and the Securities and Exchange Commission, I said, watching my father's face drain of color. The investigation is preliminary, but the documentation suggests violations of multiple federal and state financial regulations. The presentation concluded with an offer that was designed to be rejected. I would agree to drop all legal actions and remain silent about their deception and financial irregularities if they met several conditions. Public acknowledgement that their claims about my mental health and substance abuse were false. Written, apologies to everyone they had lied to about my character. Full restoration of my inheritance rights. And my father's resignation from Chen Associates with Marcus assuming full control of the company. As I expected, my father rejected these terms immediately and angrily. His response revealed exactly the character that had been hidden beneath years of polished social presentation. "You ungrateful little bitch," he shouted, abandoning any pretense of parental concern. "We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us? You're nothing without this family, and you'll be nothing when we're finished with you." His outburst, which Patricia recorded with his knowledge, destroyed any remaining credibility for his claims that his actions had been motivated by concern for my well-being. No loving parent would speak to their child with such vicious hatred, regardless of their disappointment with that child's choices. "I think this meeting has served its purpose," Patricia said calmly. "My client has made a reasonable offer for resolving this situation. Your rejection of that offer leaves us with no choice but to proceed with formal legal action." As we prepared to leave, my mother spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Her words were quiet, but revealed the cold calculation that had always existed beneath her maternal facade. "Sarah, you're making a terrible mistake. You have no idea how powerful your father's connections are, or how much damage we can do to your life if you continue this path. Think very carefully about whether destroying your family is really worth whatever satisfaction you think you'll get from this revenge." Her threat was exactly what I had expected and what I was prepared for. "Linda," I replied, using her first name deliberately to signal the end of any pretense of family relationship. "You've already destroyed our family. You did that the night you chose to publicly humiliate and disown your daughter rather than having an honest conversation about your concerns. What I'm doing now isn't revenge, it's justice." The meeting ended with clear battle lines drawn. My parents had chosen to escalate rather than acknowledge their wrongdoing, which freed me to pursue every available legal and social remedy without guilt or hesitation. Within 48 hours of our confrontation, the coordinated pressure campaign began in earnest. Tom Harrison's article appeared on the front page of the Seattle Business Journal, detailing Chen Associates' financial irregularities and raising serious questions about investor fraud. The article also included information about my father's character assassination campaign, presenting it as evidence of his willingness to manipulate and deceive when his interests were threatened. The impact was immediate and devastating. Several major investors demanded emergency meetings to review their involvement with Chen Associates. The company's bank called in loans that had been secured based on asset valuations that were now clearly inflated. Business partners began distancing themselves from future projects, citing concerns about financial transparency and ethical practices. My father's social and professional network, which had been the foundation of his power and influence, began to collapse as people reassessed their relationships with someone who had been exposed as a systematic liar and manipulator. The same community leaders who had endorsed his treatment of me were now questioning every interaction they had ever had with him. Patricia filed defamation lawsuits against my father and 3 of his business associates who had actively repeated his lies about my character. The lawsuits demanded substantial financial damages and public retractions, but more importantly, they created legal discovery processes that would expose even more evidence of deception and manipulation. The Attorney General's investigation expanded based on additional evidence that Marcus provided, including documents showing that my father had used investor funds for personal expenses and had misrepresented the company's financial position in multiple official filings. Federal authorities began their own investigation into potential securities fraud and tax evasion. Most satisfying was watching my father's attempt to maintain control over the family narrative completely collapse. Marcus had informed Jennifer's parents about the financial irregularities and legal investigations, leading them to postpone the engagement indefinitely. They were not willing to have their daughter's reputation associated with a family under investigation for financial fraud. My father's isolation became complete when several of his own employees began cooperating with investigators rather than risk their own legal liability. His decades of controlling through fear and manipulation backfired spectacularly as people chose to protect themselves rather than maintain loyalty to someone who was clearly facing serious legal consequences. The investigation revealed additional victims of my father's manipulation and abuse. Former employees came forward with stories of intimidation and retaliation. Business partners shared evidence of fraudulent practices they had previously been afraid to report. Even some family friends admitted they had always been uncomfortable with my father's controlling behavior, but had been afraid to speak up. Within 3 months of my decision to fight back, my father's empire of deception and control had been completely dismantled. Chen Associates was under federal investigation, facing multiple lawsuits and struggling to avoid bankruptcy. My father's reputation in Seattle's business community was destroyed beyond repair. The social connections that had been the foundation of his influence had evaporated as people distanced themselves from the scandal. Most importantly, the truth about my exile had been exposed publicly and completely. Everyone who had endorsed my father's treatment of me now understood that they had been manipulated into supporting family abuse. The lies about my mental health and substance abuse had been thoroughly debunked, and my professional reputation had been fully restored. My mother, who had enabled and participated in the campaign against me, found herself facing social isolation, as Seattle's charity and social organizations quietly removed her from leadership positions. The couples who had been their closest friends began declining invitations and avoiding social events where they might encounter people who had been exposed as systematic liars and manipulators. Marcus had taken control of what remained of Chen Associates and was working to restructure the company's debts and restore legitimate business practices. The process would be difficult and expensive, but it offered the possibility of eventually rebuilding the family business on an honest foundation. The legal consequences continued to multiply as investigators uncovered additional evidence of wrongdoing. My father faced potential criminal charges for securities fraud, investor deception, and tax evasion. The civil lawsuits were moving forward. with substantial financial damages that would strip away most of the family's remaining assets. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the complete reversal of power dynamics within our relationship. My father, who had spent decades controlling others through manipulation and intimidation, now found himself completely powerless to influence or control me. Every attempt to threaten or pressure me only provided additional evidence for the legal cases against him. The man who had declared me dead to his family had discovered that his declaration had freed me to become someone he never expected and could never control. The grateful daughter who had spent 32 years trying to earn his approval was indeed gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had learned that the most powerful response to abuse is not submission or avoidance, but strategic resistance executed with intelligence and determination. My father had wanted to erase me from his family's story. Instead, his attempts at erasure had made me the central character in a new story, one where truth triumphed over lies, where justice prevailed over manipulation, and where the victim became the architect of her abuser's downfall. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.